And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen podcast. So this is part 3 of a 4-part study on how can we as the church engage Gen Z. So if you missed the first 2 pieces of this, I really encourage you to go back and listen before you listen to this one. On the first part, we had Anna Gosman, who is a Christian school administrator, has been doing that for about 15 years, talking about generational distinctives, and then also teaching methods, how to effectively engage Gen Z in that way. And I certainly really enjoyed that episode, learned much from it. And then next up, we had Senator John Crane, who is a state senator in the state of Indiana, a former pastor, and then leads a student worldview organization, talking about how to help Gen Z form a Christian worldview. And then this week, I'm going to jump in and talk about how can we engage Gen Z. The idea being, what good is a worldview if it's never viewed by the world? So how do we take Gen Z's desire to change the world, and then how do we help them with that? How do we take that desire and take our Christian faith outside the walls of our schools and our churches to impact our communities? And then happy to announce that next week for our capstone episode, we're going to have on someone that I consider our resident cultural apologist, Ben Shetler, to talk about evangelism and key apologetics questions. So again, this is such an important question right now. It's urgent in the sense that atheism has doubled among Gen Z, but I believe it's also a personal question as Christian parents, Christian grandparents, pastors, teachers, all wrestling with how do we engage these digital natives? They think differently than prior generations. How do we show them the beauty, the truth of the gospel? And so let me jump into my piece of this. We're going to be talking about how to engage Gen Z as Christian citizens, in a sense, getting outside the walls of our churches, our schools, our ministries, and impacting our communities with the good news of the gospel. And so for the reason that I'm engaging this piece of it is certainly as an attorney, as one that leads the Daniel Initiative in Indiana, Good Citizen Project around the country. This is something that we're doing all the time, helping churches get involved in their communities. But in addition to that, I did spend about 10 years in student ministry. I'm just so grateful for that experience. I'm actually very grateful for those students. They helped me with the issue of pride. It's really hard to get a big head when one day you're in federal court, the next day you're dodging whoopee cushions. And so I'm very grateful for just all of the interactions that I had with members of Gen Z during that time. And we had such a great time studying the word, but also serving in our community together during that time. And so I'm going to draw down on some of what I learned during that period of ministry as well. And so in every presentation that I give, I attempt to do 3 things. Certainly want to share scripture, biblical truth, but I want to do a little bit of cultural analysis. What is the culture that we're engaging? What are some of the challenges there? And then talk about spiritual formation. How do we practically take this away and make a difference? And so today I'm going to jump into basically 3 big ideas for engaging Gen Z outside the walls of our churches and our schools. And if you're watching the video, I am sharing a presentation on the video. And so if you're listening to the podcast, we'll have a link to the video in the show notes if you also want to tune into that as well. So again, 3 ideas for engaging Gen Z. And on this subject, of course, the verse that comes to mind is Matthew 5:16. We all know it, but it's still a command, all right? Let your light so shine before men, even in a quickly changing culture. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father, which is in heaven. So how can we do that? How can we effectively equip, kind of come alongside Gen Z to engage this culture? There are a couple of obstacles as I jump in to doing this well. We've talked a little bit about this when Anna was talking about generational distinctives. Of course, Senator Crane was also talking about some of this, looking at the challenges to Christian worldview. But I wanted to focus in today on a couple of obstacles that specifically affect the confidence, and sometimes the motivation of Gen Z to get outside the walls of the church, school, home, and engage others with the good news of the gospel. So we'll start there, talking about a few of those challenges. The first one that I would mention would be entitlement. Now, I say this with great respect, okay? Please understand if you're a member of Gen Z listening to this, he thinks I'm entitled. But just hold on a second. I sometimes laugh with my daughter, who's now 10 years old, that sometimes I hear from her that the TV is not working. And so I sometimes joke with her about, former generations had to deal with suffering, but Gen Z has to deal with buffering. Okay. So 100 years ago, what did people have to do? I mean, they maybe a little longer than that, but you had to go kill the deer, you had to skin the deer, you had to bring it back, start a fire, cook the deer. And now we're kind of the microwave generation. And this is true about myself as well. So I'm not letting millennials off the hook either. But I found myself just waiting for popcorn to pop and getting impatient. this is such an indicator of our generation. We are, in a sense, becoming the wealthiest generation in history. Millennials are. As baby boomers transfer their wealth, millennials again will become the wealthiest generation in history. And then if their children are members of Gen Z, Gen Z is the beneficiary of that wealth. And so it's hard. I mean, we're in one of the wealthiest nations, not just in the world now, but of all time. We have so much in the way of material goods. And it's hard if you're living in that not to have some sense of entitlement. And so that's, again, lovingly, but it is just an issue. And if you've worked with Gen Z, and I think millennials are entitled as well. So I'm saying, I'm casting the same thing at my generation, but I do think that is a challenge. The next one that I would mention would be isolation. And if the research is true, Gen Z is in a sense the loneliest generation. There was a book launched, published back in, I think, around 2000 called Bowling Alone, which lamented the rise of kind of the atomization of American society, that we used to do a lot at church together. We had all these different, bowling leagues or different associations that people participated in. But now we have, in a sense, atomized. We do so much alone. And I would notice, right, because we're a very hyper-individualized society, that when we define ourselves, when we worship ourselves and we serve ourselves, we probably shouldn't be surprised when we're by ourselves. Right? And that's why a cell phone for Gen Z is almost an appendage. And you may have heard Anna talking about how literally members of Gen Z may actually sit right next to each other and still text one another while sitting next to each other. But a lot of that does lead to loneliness. And in a sense, Gen Z is often hyper connected, but hardly connected. So, I mean, you can have 10,000 Instagram or maybe TikTok followers, but no true friends. And a couple of things that this ties right into is certainly the anxiety that Anna talked about that many members of Gen Z experience, the desire to be socially accepted. And there was a recent study that came out from Facebook that Instagram is actually harmful to teenage girls and their sense of self-image. Now, most people in the world would be like, duh, we'd have to pay for a study to know that. But in a sense, if you can imagine being in a generation where everything is hyper sexualized and you're having to compare yourself to everyone in the world, this can lead to a sense of, well, I'm just going to clam up and I'm not going to worry about other people. So certainly isolation. Again, if you're trying to encourage members of Gen Z to get outside the walls of the church and make a difference, well, getting them together to actually do that can be a challenge. The next thing that I would mention as a challenge to getting members of Gen Z outside the walls of church to make a difference in the community is a sense of drive. And the study showed that family, the sense of family for Gen Z is a diminishing priority. Now, members of Gen Z do love their parents, they're close to their parents, but education and professional development, as well as sometimes pastimes, can become more important than family activities. So, think of all that is expected of a member of Gen Z that wants to get into college or into a profession. You have college applications, grades, nonprofit service, that all of that is expected. And frankly, I think perhaps church leaders and even parents, we need to be mindful of this. Are we making members of Gen Z so busy that they don't have time for the ultimate eternal? The old, are you so busy doing the important that you don't have time for the ultimate or the eternal? And so again, members of Gen Z, and if you are in close relationship with someone in that generation, very driven. They're looking at, what is essential. I want to make a difference in my life and in my work. But that sense of drive can become almost crushing in the sense of, well, I have to be so focused on what everyone's telling me I have to do that I don't going and building relationships with a vulnerable family. Like, how does that fit into my strategic plan? That certainly can be a challenge for other generations. But it is for Gen Z. The next challenge, I think, for engaging members of Gen Z to be outside the walls of the church, making a difference with the gospel. This is truth, and this is what you need to know. That's our message to our communities. Is this sense of mistrust? Now, I think most Americans wrestle with this to some degree, but they have grown up in a time where most of the major institutions in our society have been challenged or questioned, and or they have proven themselves to be untrustworthy, right? You think about news media, government, big tech, even the church. There was an interesting study. Frank Newport says that in 1975, 68% of Americans believed that organized religion could be trusted. Again, that's 68% of Americans. By 2019, the church had reached a new low, with only about 30% of Americans having any confidence in the church and its leadership. Now, there's much to be said about that, but that's just a very wide gap. So among the institutions, you think about the sex abuse scandals and such, among the institutions, even the church is sometimes considered untrustworthy. And I'll mention one other thing that certainly we bear some responsibility for in the church, and that is broken families. In 1970, and actually this just came out from some of the census data. I just saw the study today that families, mom and dad, married parents with children in a household, that was 40% in 1970. Today, in 2021, again from the 2020 census, it is 17.8%. So from 1970 to today, it's gone from 40% to 17.8%. So if you're growing up and you see government, big tech, you can't trust them, you can't trust the church, but then even your own family, and I understand there are a lot of extenuating circumstances. I'm not talking about a specific family or maybe an abuse situation, something like that, but I'm saying society-wide, this is the institution where mom and dad have said, we promise that we are going to live together, or we're going to commit to our marriage until death does us part. And then that's just kind of thrown out as life goes on. That affects members of Gen Z. And so mistrust can be a big issue. And then the last one that I will mention as a challenge for helping Gen Z move outside the walls, be confident in their faith, and apply it in our communities is the difference, kind of the gap, I might say, between knowledge and wisdom and discernment. We often talk about Daniel on this podcast, and he's known for his courage, and he absolutely should be. But if you look at the book, he's most praised for what his wisdom, the ability to apply knowledge to a situation, to apply biblical truth to our culture. You may know there was a public service announcement from the 1980s. I was not familiar with it, but apparently a lot of people know it. And it goes like this. It says, this is your brain, and then this is your brain on drugs, showing how there's a wide disparity there. It really affects you. Brett McCracken, who we've had on the podcast, he has a great but slight revision to that. He says, this is your soul. And he's talking about today. This is your soul. And this is your soul online. So comparing this is your brain on drugs, to this is your soul online. We literally have the knowledge of all of human history at our fingertips, but we end up often just looking at cat memes or making fun of each other. And so a lot of times Gen Z has a hard time. I mean, can you imagine just coming into this? You have a tablet, all of the knowledge of human history right at your fingertips. You're drowning in information. And so how do you apply this information? How do you have good, godly knowledge and wisdom? How do you filter that? And so Gen Z is facing a tsunami of clickbait content, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what is helpful information? And so certainly we can act as a sort of curator to try to help with good practices. And by the way, the Wisdom Pyramid by Brett McCracken, I think, is a great resource. And so again, I did want to take a little bit of time. I think a lot of these are obvious, but it's important to remember them as we then move to try to engage members of Gen Z outside the walls of the church. So again, those are some of the obstacles. That's the culture that Gen Z is growing up in. And certainly if you're an older generation, just imagine growing up right now or over the last 10 to 20 years, and just think about how those things would have affected you. So let's move now into, I mentioned three ideas for engaging Gen Z. And the first one is this: it is to show and tell. Now, I'm not sure if at your school growing up, you had what they called show and tell. And so people are supposed to bring in, your latest toy or some gadget that you get to explain to the class and you're proud of it. And it's a way we get to know each other and learn more about our world. So I enjoyed show and tell. And you have to understand it in the context of this story that my mom, I believe, was my teacher, and my dad was the principal, or at least during this particular time, my dad was the principal of my school. And so I decided to bring what I thought was a fairly harmless animal to the class. And if you're again watching the video, I'm showing you a picture of a skink. It's a kind of a black lizard with a shiny blue tail. And I had caught one. I thought, it'd be great to show my class, get to learn about science a little bit. And so I was at the front of the class holding the lizard. And during my show and tell presentation, the lizard got a little restless, as I'm sure I would if I was in that situation. And I was trying to catch it as it's trying to run out of my hand. And I grabbed its tail. If you've ever grabbed a lizard's tail, you know what happened next. The tail comes off. It's a method of self-preservation for the lizard. And so the lizard gets out of my hand. I'm holding the tail. And of course, it's still moving and writhing around. So I'm kind of jumping it, and it's kind of jumping around. I'm kind of throwing it around, trying to catch the lizard. The lizard sees my classroom, decides this is not the place to survive and thrive. And so it runs under the door. And it just so happened that I think maybe like the second grade class was lined up around around the wall there. And you could literally track the process of the lizard's escape by the screams that were going through the elementary school. And so I got to go see my dad in his more professional capacity as a principal of the school. And so, show and tell didn't go all that well then. But then, things calmed down. I thought, hey, it's show and tell again. And I thought, hey, I'll bring a praying mantis. You're probably familiar with the insect. It's green. Its arms are folded there like it's praying. And we had just learned in science that one of the ways the praying mantis is able to feed itself is that it has this spit that actually paralyzes its prey. And so you have to keep that in mind with this story. And so I bring the praying mantis to show and tell, and I have it in front of the class. And I'm showing them all the praying mantis. But then the thing decides that it wants to grab my finger with these pinchers. It kind of pulls down. And of course, this kind of startles me. And I don't know what to do. And it's holding on to my finger. And so I pull it up and I'm kind of throwing it around. And then it comes off my finger and lands on the leg of one of my classmates. And this praying mantis proceeds to spit on my classmate's pants. Now, this kid was very imaginative, and he also took what our teacher said seriously. All right. She says that when the praying mantis spits on you, it paralyzes you. And so here's this kid, he's holding his leg. Oh, I'm going to be paralyzed. All right. So the praying mantis gets thrown somewhere else, and the entire class goes into disarray. And so once again, I got to go down and see my dad in his more professional capacity. And I don't think I was allowed to bring anything live into show and tell ever again. So I imagine you were in perhaps a show and tell type of presentation at some point. And as we're jumping into this, again, 3 ideas for engaging Gen Z. When I mean show and tell, I mean that basically, as we've talked in the last 2 episodes, we should be doing a good job of explaining the Christian faith to those in our classes. But in addition to that, I think we should also be showing them that Christianity is both true and good. So yes, we need to be telling them, but then how are we showing them that it's good? Let me dig into this a little bit. Psalm 34:8 says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusts in him." Again, after all that we've studied thus far, talking about the hyper-individualism in a hyper-individualistic society, we have to remember that perhaps our most persuasive tool is our own story. And I know that many Christian leaders kind of do this by instinct, but don't discount. Don't leave out the power really of your own story, your own lived experience of following Jesus. I know as a student pastor, just being able to share with the students that as I was trying to practice law and trying to be a good student pastor, try to lead a family in quickly changing times, that we had so many great conversations about that. Again, I know that many Christians do that by instinct, but this idea of doing life together, even with those that may be a decade or so younger than you, your most persuasive tool in a hyper-individualistic society is your own story. And again, some of the things I'm sharing here today are not rocket science, but how can we leverage these in our own community? So certainly your own story is persuasive. But then again, just another idea for helping members of Gen Z as we're laying the strong foundation to get them outside the walls of the church. They're confident in their faith, so they'll share it with someone else, is that we should share stories, and preferably in video format, because YouTube is certainly a big deal. TikTok is a big deal, that in a sense collapse the secular narrative around key biblical truth claims. And I'll give you an example. We were just able to interview an individual named Heather Scriba. Really looking forward to sharing that discussion with you. And Heather fully socially, physically transitioned, and then God got a hold of her heart with the idea that she was God's daughter and is now living as Heather again. And so I'm looking forward to sharing that entire story with you. It's perhaps the longest conversation I've had thus far, but it was just such a rich and helpful conversation. I also think about the story of Eric Liddell. Many of you may know him from Chariots of Fire, that he declined to run on a Sunday, but ended up winning a different race. And you may know that he later on became a missionary to China. And when the Japanese invaded, instead of leaving the country, he stayed to serve the Chinese. And he was put into a Japanese prison camp. He continued to preach and teach. And he was actually given an opportunity to leave. And this didn't come out until, I think, something like the 2008 Beijing Olympics, or the Olympics in China. And it was discovered that he actually had a chance to leave and go home to his wife and children. But at the time, they discovered that he had a brain tumor, and he knew that his time was short. So he actually gave his opportunity, his pass out of the Japanese prison camp to a pregnant Chinese woman. He's actually still honored in China today, which is interesting with our geopolitical tensions. And again, that story cuts against the narrative about and quote unquote colonial missionaries, English missionaries around the world. And what a beautiful story of not just athleticism, dedication to the Lord, but then long sacrifice in the same direction, even dying, giving up his space to a pregnant Chinese woman. And so are we telling those stories? Are we getting those stories? Certainly historical ones. Christianity is a historic global faith, but also current ones. And I would encourage you to think about individuals, even in your own community, whether that's a school or a church or within your own zip code. How can you go find some of those stories and then have them share it with your class? Now, again, this takes some work. Again, this isn't rocket science, but it does, this podcast is all about what do we do now? We'll spend some time actually digging into building some relationships with individuals in your church community so that they can tell the story. So again, we're telling them about Christianity, but are we showing them, again, within our communities of faith, our ministries, so they know that Christianity is both true and good. And then kind of last thought on this particular point is that we should explain and model the Christian life as a grand adventure marked by purpose, sacrifice, and eternal significance. How does secular culture frame the Christian life? Well, it's just a bunch of people that they have all these rules and they're unhappy and they want to just kind of push that on everyone else. And so if you follow Jesus, if you follow the church, you're not going to be able to fully express your desires. You're not going to have the good life. But Gen Z certainly wants to change the world. And so are we even in our own lives modeling that the Christian life is a grand adventure marked by purpose, sacrifice, and eternal significance? And so as parents, it's easy just to get in the daily grind and, I got to go to church again. No, we get to take part. We get to worship with other believers. We're worshiping the God of the universe, and we're building his kingdom here in a quickly changing culture. We get to represent him now in this incredible moment for the Christian church and the United States. And so even at the family level, the school level, the church level, are we infusing that? Are we talking about that? Most importantly, are we living it? And I just convicted myself, okay, because I don't always do this. And again, I'm pointing to individuals like Eric Liddell and others that down through the ages have stood up to tyrants, have served the weakest among us, and have showed the love of Christ in remarkable ways. So again, number one, I would say, is that we should both show and tell. In a sense, we kind of tell and then show, but you know how it goes. So that's number one. Are we doing that as a part of our teaching, kind of inside the walls of our ministries? The next thing that I would mention is that we need to connect the dots. And so as we have that strong foundation built, we've explained that Christianity is both true and good. It's something that we should be confident about. We then move outside the walls of our communities to, again, let our light shine before men. So when I say that we need to connect the dots, we need to, in a sense, connect the dots in between what Christianity says and then what Christianity does. Let me explain this a bit. Someone pointed this out. This is not a novel thought either, but someone pointed this out, that all of the times that Jesus kind of modeled discipleship or taught his disciples in the phrases in the way. All right, so Mark 10:32, and they were in the way going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus went before them, and they were amazed. And as they followed, they were afraid, and he took again the 12 and began to tell them what things should happen unto him. So as Jesus was teaching his disciples, he often did it in the way. They were going to some event, they were going to heal someone, they were going to preach somewhere. And it was actually in those conversations that so much of Jesus's really rich teaching to his disciples occurred. Again, just an interesting study there. So how can we look at that and kind of do the same in our own hearts, our own lives? How can we help Gen Z connect the dots between Christianity's truth and its goodness? Well, we do that by doing good with them. We do it by doing good with them. And again, so we're trying to help, again, connect the dots in between, what Christianity is and what Christianity does. And again, this was one of my favorite activities as a student pastor, going to local leaders saying, hey, what does the community need? And we did everything from serving the Salvation Army, which was helping with homelessness, and especially during cold weather. And we did things like paint ceilings. The city also needed some iron rails in this historic landmark district painted. We also helped with a food bank. And what I would always try to do is say, okay, here's why we're doing this. I've talked to the mayor. This is a key need in our community. This is how it's going to serve the people in the community. We're not just here doing this because we're checking a box. We also serve with the Pregnancy Care Center. So we're always checking the box. Here's how we're helping. Here's how this is going to strategically impact our community. This plays into the fact that Gen Z is the loneliest generation. So serving together as a community of believers impacts worldview formation, but also kind of the culture of your church, your school, your ministry. So again, if these individuals that they again are atomized, they're encouraged to be on their own devices and not spend a lot of time socializing in person, this is a great way to, again, recognize, as Anna was talking about, and Senator Crane had a great question about this, recognizing the distinctives of the generation, but then encouraging them and challenging them. Say, hey, here's how we're going to go do this together. I would mention this specifically. I've mentioned a few things specifically about members of Gen Z that are girls or females, specifically for guys in Gen Z. How do we form friendships? How do we build community? Well, just kind of sitting around talking about something, not always great. And if you're a student pastor, you could probably tell me loads and loads about this, but actually doing something together that's meaningful, you can often build relationships through that. So if you've listened to the podcast for some time, what I'm about to share is not news to you. But here in the state of Indiana, I'm just giving you one example, and you can do this in your own zip code, your own state. but is to build relationships with your local elected officials that are working on some of the tough problems in your community. Ask them how you can help. Of course, the big three that we often talk about are foster care, the drug crisis, recidivism, people coming out of jail, going back in. And so, again, if you haven't listened to the podcast for long, maybe you're new to this, a couple of quick ideas, even as we're going into the first of the year. Maybe you want to ramp this up. You've been thinking about it some before. But again, foster care, the drug crisis, recidivism, mental health has kind of become the number 4. Our lieutenant governor here in Indiana has this, is launching a large initiative dealing with mental health, especially hopefully post-pandemic. And so just a couple of notes. We've been able to build a relationship with DCS director Terry Stignan here in the state of Indiana. That's asked the church, hey, go upstream with DCS to keep kids out of foster care. You think, well, how could members of Gen Z impact this? Well, it's helping serve vulnerable families. It's helping the ministries that are serving vulnerable families. And they don't always need dollars. Sometimes they just need bodies. They just need people to help move things, paint things, beautify a space so that it reflects dignity when people walk in. So there's so many ways that you can do that. Again, I've mentioned a few that we jumped into. When it comes to the drug crisis, of course, you're thinking, well, what about safety? And again, it doesn't have to be the direct contact in between members of Gen Z and those that are wrestling with an addiction. Rather, it can be with the ministries that are doing the hard work. There are often tasks that can be done. Again, I mentioned we served with the Salvation Army in a number of different ways. If you're watching the video online, I'm sharing just a few pictures of us kind of engaging this at the state level in Indiana. And because all of these issues are so complex and they're also so comprehensive, they're everywhere from the holler to the high rise across the nation. If you want to go to your local elected officials and say, how can we engage this as a school, as a church? I don't think they're going to say no. Now, you may have to kind of grind down, go into a few meetings with the deputy saying, what's the best way for us to serve? But the doors are wide open. There's so much need in this space. And so I'm showing, again, a few pictures here on the video of us meeting with our attorney general, talking to him here in the state of Indiana. How can the church help with that particular issue? And then another idea was helping, again, we're talking about show and tell as point number 1. Now we're talking about connecting the dots in between what Christianity is, what Christianity says, and then what Christianity does. Many of the ministries that work in the foster care space, as well as the drug addiction space, have celebration events. Maybe that's an annual fundraiser. Maybe it's just an event where they're telling stories. Well, make that a student outing rather than doing something else. And hey, I love pizza. I love throwing dodgeballs and all that. But again, if Gen Z really wants to change the world and you're helping them connect the dots between, okay, this is what we talked about and how, Jesus, the gospel is what truly transforms a life. And then let's go see how that actually plays out. I think that's probably a more strategic use of our time. So one quick example, and I actually have the picture on the video, but of a couple that I heard from at one of these celebration events. And it was a couple, both of them were addicted to drugs. They lost their children. They were arrested, put in jail. They both came to Christ independently. And at the time of this celebration, they were back together. They had jobs. Their family was intact once more. And I know we have a fairly sophisticated audience out there, but if you've ever heard the term baby mama, baby daddy, we may mark the end of Western civilization with the advent of that term. But you know what I'm talking about? The man had an affair. And at the time of this particular celebration, the week or so before, he had led his baby mama to Christ and had just had the opportunity to baptize her. And what I love sharing is, look, you can't legislate purpose, you can't legislate hope, and you can't enforce into law that type of transformation. It is only the gospel of Jesus Christ that brings that kind of transformation. So again, you're helping them connect the dots, and you're doing it with them is the key. We talked a little bit about mental health and how this is the loneliest generation. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a stat that we've been pointing out to elected officials that everyone's mental health declined in 2020, except for one group, and that was those individuals that attended regular or weekly religious services in person, and their mental health was actually up 4 points in 2020. And so again, diving into the issue of mental health, talking about how is the church serving those that suffer through mental health issues or deal with mental health issues. How is the church doing that? And what does Christianity do in that area? How does it affect that through Christian counseling, etc.? And so again, lots of ideas here. You think about those 4 big ones. I imagine anywhere in the United States and even perhaps around the world, if you go to local officials and say, are these a problem? How can we help? Again, there's just a wide open door that allows us as ministry leaders to connect the dots, help Gen Z connect the dots in between what Christianity says and what it does. It's effective. It makes a difference in people's lives. And so one interesting thing here, and again, we're just thinking about the challenges that Gen Z has and trying to help Gen Z kind of move outside the walls of the church. Some data from, this is a little bit of an older study, but 2015 reports that those 16 to 19 years of age have a higher volunteer rate, something like 26%, compared to a volunteer rate of about 18.4 of those age 20 to 24. So certainly if you've talked to members of Gen Z, they want to change the world. And as Senator Crane was talking about, in some ways, they have opportunities to change the world that in prior generations perhaps could have only dreamed of. And so let's encourage that. They want to volunteer. They have that heart. They want to change the world. So why not connect the dots between what Christianity says and what it does by ministering with them, connecting the dots alongside them? And so that is number 2. We have to help them connect the dots, and we should do it with them. And so a quick question for you as just a follow-up here is, before you can pause the podcast, move on to whatever's next in your life, pause the video, what are some ways that you as the leader of a family or a Sunday school teacher, a small group teacher, a teacher at a Christian school, leader of a Christian school or church, what are some ways that you can serve God together in your community with members of Gen Z? Just some food for thought there. And then number 3, last one here, is that we should follow the leader. Follow the leader. If you've listened to podcasts long, we do talk about Daniel a good bit, but it's a fascinating story. Of course, it's relevant in our cultural moment because, as you know the story, here are these Hebrew teenagers. Maybe they're young adults by the time they're taken off to Babylon, but probably members of what we would consider Gen Z. And they're taken from this very monolithic religious society where everyone's ethnically Jewish, religiously Jewish. I mean, everything's the same. And they're taken to this very multicultural pagan society in Babylon. And everyone that they've known, all of their authority figures are gone. And yet they stand. They stand for the Lord in this remarkably multicultural, diverse society where all of the pressure, even their own lives, their own death, even in the face of that, they stand for what's true. So I've always just, again, scratched my head, especially as related to this topic. How did that happen? All right, that does not just happen because, I mean, think about the church today. How many members of Gen Z, how many millennials go to church their entire life and they're not facing the pressure of death? It's more of a soft power. It's, as we've talked about in the shadow war, it's more of a seduction, and they fall into that and they fall away from the faith. And so the experience of the church today makes the story of Daniel and his friends even more amazing. And so how did that happen? So sometimes we talk about the forgotten figure, the forgotten hero in the story of Daniel is actually King Josiah. Why? Because King Josiah restored the temple. He restored the reading of scripture. He restored discipleship. So the answer to the question, how did Daniel and his friends stand against threats, against persecution in this very diverse pagan culture? It, in some ways, is simple. Someone taught them. Someone discipled them. Someone showed them that this is the way of Jehovah. And this is truth. And this is good. And this is beautiful. and this is how you should order your life. And somehow that discipleship was so effective that when they landed in Babylon, they stood. And so when I say follow the leader, I'm pointing back to that. And I will admit to you, just being very frank and open, if I had it to do again in student ministry, I probably would have spent less time throwing these huge events with pizza and, feeling bad if we don't have something like 35 to 40 teenagers at something, because that's just the way I've seen youth ministry done. And that's kind of how we measured success, is how many people are there. And certainly we want numbers. We want to minister to more and more individuals in our society. But I realized later on that even we'd have these big events, but my most effective ministry during that period was not so much the kid I was able to pull in for one event or two events. My most effective ministry in that period was to those students that were doing the ministry with me. We ran a van route for some time and have students with me as we were doing that. And I've realized now that my most effective ministry was actually to those that I was doing ministry with. And so I would have spent more time making key disciples among Gen Z, so they then could go invite their friends. And so again, just a slight difference that I would have engaged or would have pursued if I was doing it for the first time now. So again, that forgotten figure there is King Josiah. He discipled them. Someone discipled them in Jerusalem. They went to synagogue. They went to classes. Somehow they became disciples of Jehovah. And so Gen Z wants to change the world. And I sometimes joke, Gen Z wants to change the world, but in a sense, and this goes into the category of balancing understanding Gen Z and challenging them. And so I would say this to a member of Gen Z right in front of me, is that, we want to change the world, but we want to do it without offending anyone. But my point is that that's not how Christ transformed hearts and minds. Now, it's not that we become jerks, but there are those that we disagree with. And what they are promoting is false and it's harmful and it's not going to lead to flourishing. I love what John Stonestreet says: ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And so as we set out, talking about, okay, we want to change the world. How are we going to do that effectively? You don't have to take my word for it. Look to Jesus. And that's the key point of this. We're supposed to follow the leader. And that is, since Gen Z is skeptical of authority, even those in the church, the best approach is to point students straight to Jesus and the authority of Scripture as the foundation of their faith. There's some conversation with both Anna and John about when a member of Gen Z brings a question to you, and maybe this is a student that's been in church most of their life. It's like, is God real? Or what about transgenderism? What about same-sex attraction? Some of these questions, like, oh, it's not a sanctioned question in church. You can't ask that here. And as we've talked about, the way you respond to that initial question may immediately shut them down, and they will go ask it somewhere else. And so I've found it so helpful. And again, I know many ministering in this space have done this as well. Is not to say, look to me, look to the pastor. And I don't think anyone explicitly says that, but that can come across in our ministry. And so even when challenged, even when questioned, we continue to point to Christ. Because again, how does a member of Gen Z, I mean, you think about the challenges that members of Gen Z are going to face. I think about this for my own kids. I'm sure as a grandparent, you thought about it for your grandkids, a parent for your kids, as a leader for those in your ministry in Gen Z. How are they going to navigate a culture that increasingly thinks that Christian beliefs or truths are relevant, and even perhaps worse, harmful? And I come back to Luke 9:23, which I think is the most countercultural verse in our society. Jesus says, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. And so for members of Gen Z, they've grown up in this time of hyper individualization, of hedonism. Basically, you do you, whatever feels good, you go do it. But I think members of of Gen Z, some of them at least, are finding that a bit empty. And so how can we help them follow Jesus in this time? I was going to show you a few quick stats on kind of where Gen Z is in their sense of morality. So this is a recent study by Barna. Beliefs about moral issues by generations. And so if you're watching the video, you'll be able to see this. There are a couple of issues here. One of the statements that was surveyed is lying is morally wrong. Among boomers and elders, it's around 60%. Among Gen Z, it's about 30%. Abortion is wrong, about 40% among elders, boomers, and somewhere around 30 with Gen Z. Marriage should be a lifelong commitment between a man and a woman. 66% among elders, and around that with boomers, about 38% among Gen Z. And then sex before marriage is morally wrong. Among Gen Z, it's about 21%. Actually hasn't changed much with the generations. And then with this particular one, and this really zeroes in on the point of this third idea, beliefs about morality by faith segment. And Barna uses the term kind of no faith, and then it comes down to kind of other faith, unchurched Christian, and then an engaged Christian. And I love the term that I believe Kinnaman uses, which is this resilient disciple. Are you becoming a resilient disciple? So here was the survey question. It is not okay to challenge another person's belief. Among those of no faith, it's like 17%. Among church Christian, it's 10%. But among engaged Christians, it was about 30%, saying that, no, it is okay to challenge another person's belief. And so those that are following Jesus closely, they're the engaged, resilient disciple. They're okay with kind of challenging and saying, here's what I believe is true, and it's good for you too. And then another issue, here was the question. If your beliefs offend someone or hurt their feelings, it is probably wrong. Among those of no faith, it's something like 37%. Among engaged Christians, it's something like 65%. So if your beliefs offend someone or hurt their feelings, it is probably wrong. And so engaged Christians feel like, okay, if what I say offends someone else, then I'm probably wrong. And so that's a real challenge for us as ministry leaders to combat that. And so again, coming to kind of our conclusion here today, the idea being, how do we engage Gen Z as they get outside the walls of the church, the outside of the ministry to impact our communities, and then they go and share the gospel to others? How are we going to help them do that in a world that says if somebody disagrees with you and you're pushing what you believe, that's actually what's wrong? Well, I come back again to what Jesus said. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. I love what John Mark Comer says in his book, Live No Lies. He says that our deepest or our strongest desires, it's a great quote and I got to get it right. All right. Our strongest desires are often not our deepest desires. Our strongest desires are often not our deepest desires. So a desire to look at one example, a desire to look at a pornographic film is not truly our deepest desire, which is to have a lifelong, fulfilled, intimate relationship with our husband or with our wife, depending on which side of that you are. And so, a husband that's tempted to look at pornography, is that may be a desire right now, but what is your true deepest desire? And I think that's relevant to members of Gen Z, is all of the hedonism out there. Just follow your heart, do whatever you want. But what's your deepest desire? Isn't it to change the world? Isn't it to live a life like Christ? Like some of these historic Christians and the Christians that are living today that are denying themselves, but so that they can serve others. And that is how you truly change the world, by following Christ. And so today, again, just some ideas. I don't have all the answers. I do have some ideas. I would certainly welcome yours. Feel free to jump in on the comment section or to send us an email, josh@goodcitizen.us. But a couple ideas in review is that we need to show and tell. We need to explain our faith for sure, but we also need to share stories, our own stories perhaps, but then the stories of others. And then we need to help connect the dots in between what Christianity says and what it does. And we need to do it with members of Gen Z, showing them, yes, Christianity actually makes a difference. And this is how. It is the transformative power that our broken society needs. And here's exhibit A and B and C and D, etc. And then lastly, follow the leader. in a quickly changing world where it is hard to trust almost any institution and where everyone falls. We have to point Gen Z back to a relationship, a deep walk with Jesus. And that's how they become a resilient disciple. And let modernity throw what it will at them. They will stand, just like Daniel and his friends. So one last question here, just for you to kind of mull on as we close, is does your school or your church, your ministry have a class or program that helps members of Gen Z evangelize their peers? This, again, because of that belief that, look, if I say something that somebody else disagrees with, I'm harming them, it's wrong to do that. That is something we have to take head on. It is so critical that we address that by showing, no, this is loving, to tell them about the good news of Jesus. On the download that you'll find in the show notes, there are a number of resources. I'll mention just a few here quickly. David Kinman's book, Faith for Exiles, 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. Sam Alberry, What God Has to Say About Our Bodies. Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Brett McCracken's The Wisdom Pyramid. Dan Spader, 4-Chair Discipling. And I'll stop there. But those are just a couple of the resources that are listed there, as well as links to some of the studies that I've shared. And so once again, we come back to the task in front of us. How are we going to help members of Gen Z follow Jesus in a quickly changing time? I believe these are ways that we can do that effectively. First, we need to show and tell. We need to help them connect the dots. And then we need to help them, point them to following the leader, following Jesus Christ in a quickly changing time. Hope this has been helpful. Again, would love to have your feedback on this, and stay tuned in for next week as we have Ben Shatler on to talk a little bit more about this question of evangelism and some of the key apologetics questions that's been raised by Gen Z.